The Priestess Rising is something that's jumped up at me over the course of the last year or so in understanding the Saturn Pluto Conjunction. The Saturn Pluto Conjunction is going to be exact in January, and then Saturn came into Capricorn at the winter solstice of 2018. Yes. And then we've had, and it's been getting closer and closer, and we've had a series of eclipses. Starting last January, we had an eclipse of the Sun and the Moon, all in alignment with Saturn and Pluto, and we had the same thing happen in July of this year, and then we get one more of those in December and January, and that's kind of I don't know about you guys, but I felt those times were really key in my own process. So much intensity in the times, and so we're going to explore the meaning of the Saturn-Pluto conjunction. We'll also look at some of the alignments that have preceded it, and then we'll look in history into the meaning of the alignments and what's going on. And so we'll go into in quite a bit of detail. So everybody's a little bit familiar with astrology, or do we have some brand new ones? Everybody's kind of familiar a little bit. Okay. We'll make it pretty clear. So I was saying that in my work, in understanding the Saturn-Pluto conjunction, I've been doing a lot of readings with folks who have been feeling it, especially folks born between 80 to 83, 84. That generation are born with the Saturn-Pluto in conjunction in Libra, and Saturn and Pluto in conjunction in Capricorn is squaring that conjunction. And so that generation is really feeling it. Also, been doing a lot of charts with folks born in the late 80s and early 90s, and those folks have Saturn, Neptune, and Pluto in a triple conjunction, also in Capricorn. And so then the Saturn-Pluto conjunction is triggering their triple conjunction as well. And then also folks born in the 60s have quite a polarity between Virgo and Pisces, with the Uranus and Pluto, and Saturn and Chiron, and then that Saturn-Pluto is triggering those angles in sextile and trine. I'm getting really technical here, but basically many of us are getting triggered by this Saturn-Pluto conjunction, and it's making quite a bit of, it's forcing us to face a lot of shadow in our process. And so as I was doing readings with those folks and going through analyzing and dealing with the crisis that they were going through, I realized that there's something deeply powerful about the crisis that we're all in. And so, and as I was going along the process, this concept of the Priestess Rising came about, and as I was working with that concept through the readings and through my workshops, then I started integrating the myth of Persephone into that, and so then the myth of Persephone, from an astrological perspective, explains this process of the Priestess Rising. So this concept, this idea, this metaphor that I'm using for defining the spirit of our times is based on these ideas, based on these studies that I've done over the last year and a half or so. First, I think it's important for those who've been here for the first time to maybe introduce my work a little bit more, and especially introduce the work of Carl Jung in terms of what he saw in the shifting of our times. So the Healer and the Dreamer, Astrology for New Age, is a workshop series. We've done, this is our fourth or our fifth? 1, 2, 3, 4. Fifth, yes, it is our fifth. Fifth workshop here, and we're going to start the whole process again in the new year. And then we're just entering now a series of 6 workshops that are going to be about integrating astrology in your practice, and we'll start that next Monday. And I will tell you more about that a little bit later. Where was I? Yes, Jung. Jung and so the Healer and the Dreamer, Astrology for New Age is a book that I'm writing about how to integrate astrology into our practices using Jungian psychology, alchemy, and dream work. So it's a wide lens that I'm casting, and basically I'm trying to resource the healer, the creative practitioner, the healing practitioner, the spiritual practitioner, and the artist in understanding how astrology can support their unfolding, but also to integrate astrology and the synchronicity that works between astrology and dream work, and in that way provide tools for this great shift that we're going through. My studies have been deeply affected by the work of Carl Jung, and in the late 1930s, early 1940s, Jung did a series of essays, actually from the mid-30s to the late 40s. He did 4 or 5 essays on what happened in Germany before and after, and he gives it a psychological analysis. And in the introduction to that, he talks about, in the introduction, he breaks into a full-on astrological analysis of the times. And was one of the very first ones to speak of the age of Aquarius. And he said in the introduction that at the time where ages are shifting, and he calls them Platonic months. So Platonic months meaning a period of about 2,200 years, calculated by the precession of the equinoxes, and how the equinoxes move slowly into the sky and they go through one sign in a period of about 2,200 years. And whenever they shift from one sign to the other, when they are profound, he calls them a profound transformation of the psychic dominance. So psychic dominance or archetypes. And what are archetypes? Archetypes are intrinsic, instinctual patterns of behavior wired into the psyche. They, just like the mother archetype, or the divine son archetype, the trickster archetype. They are archetypes that are modes of behavior that are built into the psyche, and we kind of tap into these. I had a cat who I got this cat very young, and he was a very neurotic little girl, and really needy, and been taken away from her mom too early, and was a very, very needy cat. And then all of a sudden she got pregnant, and then she shifted. All of a sudden she became this incredible hunter and this incredible fierce protector, and then she raised the brood of kitties, and started taking home squirrels and rats and whatever. Every day, every morning I would wake up, open the door, and there'd be tails. That's all. And she, so then you could see how she had become possessed by the mother archetype. And even though she never was properly trained, even though she never really knew what she was doing, somehow the archetype of the mother took over, and then she could just handle the whole experience of having a litter of kitties. And so archetypes are like that. They're partly instinctual, and they're partly personal as well. They are independent patterns in the psyche in which we alternatively become or use or become possessed by, and then astrology is basically a pattern of archetypes. These archetypes shift in the change of ages, Jung said, and that shifting of the archetypes, they change. These psychic dominants change personality. And he talks, and his work is really quite descriptive of the changes that occur. Well, first he talks about the age of Taurus, then the age of Aries, and he talks about the shift that happened between the age of Aries and the age of Pisces. And he's written many interesting essays on that concept. One of them, most importantly, in Eon, where he talks about what happened at that shift between the age of Aries. The age of Aries, the gods, the age of Aries was kind of the patriarchal era. In the age of Taurus and the beginning of Aries, we had the matriarchal cults, and then gradually the patriarchal cults took over in the age of Aries, and then the gods were very ambivalent. We had the Greek pantheon, and then we had Jehovah, who was kind of a conflicted god, and then and Jung makes an essay on Job. Job's story is about 400 or 500 years before Christ entered, and that was kind of the beginning. And Jung talks about how, if you know the story of Job, Job was, God and the devil kind of made a wager. The devil said, we're going to break your great follower. He's not going to be able to handle if you test him, and he will stop loving you. And so they made this wager, and then God, Jehovah, tested him by taking everything away from him. And so then Job went on the top of a mountain, and he fasted, and he said, "What's up, God? Jehovah, what's up? Man, I've been so devoted to you." And he kind of gives God a lecture, and at that point God realizes that, I made a mistake. And Jung says that at that point God decided that I have to become human to experience what it's like to be a human. And so then he comes as Jesus, and it ushers a great shift in ages. And then Jung really describes that whole progression of the 2,000 years of the Christian era, and then he tells how now this God, these archetypes, they are shifting again. We're entering into the age of Aquarius, and now we're more and more discovering that God is within us. And so we're in this painful process of redefining our relationship with God, and Jung's work. We know Jung as a psychiatrist and a doctor and one of the founding fathers of psychology, but there's another side of his personality that was deeply mystical and deeply connected with astrology, with alchemy, with mysticism, and he felt that these spiritual constructs really defined psychology, and that you needed to have these definitions or an engagement, a spiritual engagement, if you were going to be healthy. And so, of course, Jung didn't fit into the modern, construct, and was kind of relinquished to the margins of society, but still created a body of work that informs. So in this introduction, he says, there's this great shift going on, and it's tremendously painful, and I know I'm a psychiatrist and a doctor, and these things are, these subject matters are usually tackled by people who are seers and prophets. And so I risk my reputation by taking up this subject matter, but I do so because I'm so deeply concerned for those who are caught unaware of these great shifts into the psyche. And so then I do so fully understanding that the chisel of my words will barely make an impression on the hard stone it encounters. So Jung's work, and the esoteric part of Jung's work, especially in his alchemical work and his later work, was especially aimed at preparing us for the great shift between the Piscean age and the Aquarian age. And then there are different dates that are given as to when the Aquarian age comes, and usually it's a period of about 200 years. And they are, Jung said, well, that the equinox point came into the first stars of Aquarius in 1940, and then there are those who say about 2000, 2012, like that, and then there are other dates that say 2150. So we're in that pocket, where we're redefining our age. And so that's the context in which my studies have taken me, is to try to understand what's going on. And then now we're going to look at the chart of the present moment. Actually we're going to look at the chart of the next new moon, which is on the 26th, Sagittarius new moon, and we'll break out the chart and we'll talk about that. And then I will tell you the story of Persephone after we do a bit of an astrological analysis of the current chart. So that's a bit of an introduction, and I know I've tackled a lot of complex ideas. If there's any questions, I can try to answer. Was that muddy or is that clear? Clear? Cool. Felt muddy in my mind. Any questions that we have? Makes sense? Okay. Cool. So this gives us a chance to kind of introduce the astrological dynamics and how astrology works. And so we're going to put the planets together. And I should have prepared. So starting next week, for those who have been following along and coming to all the workshops, we're going to get into the astrological dynamics, and the first 4 workshops that we did, we're mostly introducing the concepts of Jungian psychology and dream analysis. I do that because when we get into actually interpreting charts, having a really good psychological background is going to really help in helping you understand the psychology of astrology. And then we'll review these concepts as we go along.
Do you want a hand map?
Sure. So we have the Earth in the center. It's a geocentric system. So how's everybody feeling the times? Am I the only one that's really struggling? Or
Nope.
okay, I guess I am the only one. That didn't mean to be a joke. That didn't mean to be a joke, but I guess it felt funny.
What's your problem?
All right, maybe I should. Yeah, it's intense, huh? And how did everybody feel this Mercury retrograde thing? That was so much fun, wasn't it?
One of the worst.
That was one of the worst.
Yeah.
Well, you know, the Mercury retrograde is actually not really to blame. The intensity between Saturn and Pluto is what's going on. But first, let's break down the chart of, and for those who haven't done much astrology, I'm going to give you a basic introduction to the system. It's also, next week what we're going to do is, and next week I'm not going to be able to be here on Tuesday, so we're moving to Monday next week. I hope that works for everybody. And then the week after we'll go back to Tuesdays. And then next week we're going to do the introduction to the basics of astrology, and we're going to lay the ground for the deeper studies. We're going to, the table and the planets and the aspects. Anyway, I'll do that next week. But for today, so where's our sun? Our sun is just for now, right now, it is it's on the 22nd, it's going to come in to Sagittarius. So it's not quite in Sagittarius, but we're doing the new moon. So the sun will be in early Sagittarius. And then, of course, the moon's going to come into Sagittarius as well. This is the 26th of the month. So the system is a geocentric system, so the Earth is in the center. So from our perspective, when the Earth spins around the sun, we know that, but it also spins around itself. That's how we got, our days and our nights. And so from our perspective, of course, the moon is really close to the Earth, and then the sun. And so then a new moon is when the sun and the moon are together. And if you don't know anything about astrology, the most important part of astrology, are you guys seeing back there? Okay. I'm kind of, so it's a perfect mandala. So then the sun and the moon, if you don't know anything about astrology, just getting connected with understanding the cycle of the sun and the moon. So at the new moon, the sun and the moon are together. And the alchemists, they call that the sacred marriage. So the sun and the moon are together. Jung wrote a book, his last major title was called The Mysterium Conjunctionis, the mystery of the new moon, an alchemical perspective to the conjunctio, the conjunction of the sun and the moon. So he wrote a 600-page alchemical text on the new moon. And that's how committed Jung was to astrology and to alchemy. And that was the last really great book that he wrote. Took him 10 years to write. And so the sun and the moon conjunct with each other, the new moon. It's like a nuptial night, it's like the marriage. It's the union of the sun and the moon. There's a seed planted at the new moon. when the moon comes to the first quarter, that seed that was planted at the new moon germinates. Now we get an inkling of what was born at that time. And then that seed germinates and grows, and at the full moon, the fruit emerges of the seed planting. Then there's the harvest, and then the third quarter, and then the fourth quarter is getting ready again. So this energetic cycle, if we set intention and do deep meditation, use this as a theurgical system, understand that it is a relationship between the sun and the moon, or an inner relationship between my masculine side and my feminine side. And that in my inner process there is a confrontation of the two. That's why new moons are quite difficult. Full moons are energetic, but a new moon is the death of a cycle and the rebirth of another one. And so it becomes a very important time for meditation and setting intention. And as you set your intention and use it as a sacred practice, then that seed that was planted, when it fructifies, I get an idea of how this intention is manifesting. And then the second quarter is a lot of hard work to bring about that intention, and then usually the full moon will bring about the realization of my intention, and then the harvest period, and then again we prepare and set intention for the new cycle. So all planets have the same cycle with each of them, and as we study astrology, we get to learn the significance of all of these cycles. So that's the new moon. Okay. Yes, please.
When you set an intention in the new moon, and our new moon will be in Sagittarius, but the full moon, the next full moon in Sagittarius won't be for another 6 months, right?
Yes, but
so would it be in this lunar cycle, or is it by the next one where the full moon actually comes full in Sagittarius in 6 months?
Every new moon, the full moon will be in the opposite sign.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So then at that full moon,
at
so
the next one, not
this one.
Okay.
So one cycle.
Okay.
One cycle is independent of the other, but yes, they keep moving, but we're talking about the 28-day cycle now.
Okay.
Yes. Okay, so new moon in Sagittarius, what's going on? Mercury just turned direct in Scorpio. Now it's moving back towards the sun. So Mercury's function is to gather information. Why does does Mercury actually move backwards when it's going retrograde? The reason Mercury is called Mercury retrograde is because from our perspective on the Earth, Mercury turns around the sun like this. Okay? Both Mercury and Venus are between the Earth and the sun. So they turns kind of like this. So when the Mercury goes 22 degrees past the sun, it goes back. And then we had, you guys remember that last full moon that we had? And how intense that full moon was? When Mercury was so we had the full moon in Scorpio, and we had Mercury in conjunction with the sun, with the moon in Taurus, in exact alignment. And when Mercury is within 1 degree of the sun, there's a cheerful little word for it. It's called combustion. and usually we have the mind gets all short circuit, you know. And so then leading to that full moon, you know, Mercury was passing between the sun and the earth with the full moon. So that was a real kicker. And then now it's moving direct. So then again, Mercury goes like this, and it does so that it does 3 spins around the sun, while the sun makes 1 year around the zodiac. So then we have, you know, there's a 13 conjunction of the suns and 13 oppositions of the sun and the moon during a year, and there's 6 conjunctions of the sun and Mercury throughout a year. And so then, because of that, the ancient took this Mercury to be the messenger of the sun. And retrograde means that I'm reviewing the information. As the sun's moving along, Mercury's going back. It gathers information. It's review mode. And then when it turns direct, as it is doing right now, then now, okay, we've reviewed all the information, and then by the time the next full moon comes along, then Mercury will be again in conjunction with the sun. And so then we'll have, then Mercury will move ahead. And so Mercury is the guide of souls, the psychopomp. It is how the sun gathers information. Now Venus is the inner princess, and Venus does the same thing. And what's going on with Venus, if you get a clear night after sunset, you'll see Venus, who's becoming really bright and nice and high in the sky. Venus goes 40 degrees ahead of the sun and then turns to, you know, retrograde. They'll be retrograde this winter. And so, but now it's doing this thing, and you can see it on a clear night right after the sun, and you'll see also Jupiter. And now Jupiter and Venus in the next few weeks are going to get closer and closer to the exact conjunction with each other. And you can see that in the sky every night now on a clear night. So we have Jupiter, Venus, Sun, and Moon, and then Mercury coming in, and then also Mars coming into Scorpio. So that's kind of the new moon right here with the personal planets. Mars is the will, Venus is the inner princess, is the feeling, and then Mercury is the gathering of the information, or the messenger, or the trickster. So new moon, so moon, sun, Venus, Jupiter, all in Sagittarius. How does that feel to you guys? You want to put some you know, spell that out. So Jupiter, of course, I mean Sagittarius is the home of Jupiter, and so Jupiter is optimism. Sagittarius is so the symbol of Sagittarius is a centaur. Centaur meaning half animal, half human. So symbolizing our animal side and our human side, with the arrow aiming at the highest point, symbolizing the balance of the animal and the human aiming at the highest point. So Sagittarius seeks to manifest what is highest. It's adventurous, it's exciting, it's a fire sign, it's a mutable sign, it's a masculine sign. So with Jupiter there and Venus in conjunction, Venus is my feelings, my emotions, what I love, and then Jupiter, Venus, I get the feeling, and then especially when we get to the full moon, you know, so that'll be at the end, middle of December. We'll have the full moon, in Gemini, and then we'll have the Sun, Venus, and Jupiter in a triple conjunction. That's going to be, I don't know, I think it's a really good time to fall in love.
Does it mighty sweet. Does it happen in your solstice, the full moons?
The full moon, the solstice, the Capricorn new moon is on the 25th of December. So this will be earlier in December, about the 10th or so, this new moon, this full moon with, you know, so you get the feeling that this is, that we're entering into, when the sun enters into Sagittarius in a few days, and then with Jupiter and Venus getting closer and closer, that is liable to be quite a bright and Sagittarian, fiery kind of time. So that's the inner planets. Okay. Are you guys all following?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Dreamy. The new moon sounds dreamy.
It does sound dreamy. It does sound dreamy, for sure. Another thing about the new moon, so Sagittarius, Gemini. Okay, yeah. One of the things about this, and then one of the exciting things that have been going on is Uranus at the beginning of Taurus has been in a opposition to Mars. And so that's, you know, it's like, you know, they're, you know, so Mars and Uranus in opposition with each other. Uranus is the great revolutionary. Mars is the warrior. So we've been a little feisty. I mean, is that part of what you guys are feeling?
Yep.
Yep. Okay. And so that will go on for a little while longer, and then Mars will move away, and then we'll have Mars and Mercury coming in further into, and see the train is coming down, you know, so when you, in astrology, the Sun, Mercury, and Venus are never far, and then the Moon always comes around, so that it's kind of like the royal procession, you know, the queen, the king, the messenger, and the inner princess are all moving along the zodiac. Now they're in conjunction with Saturn, with the Jupiter, and as Jupiter moves into Capricorn, and as the train moves into, they're going to come to Saturn and Pluto in Capricorn. And so this next little while there should have this Sagittarian flavor, but by the beginning of December, we'll have that conjunction, and then Jupiter will move in, and then the Sun will move in on the 21st, and then Venus will be ahead. So now we're coming into what I expect will be a pretty intense time, and that Mercury retrograde we've been going through is kind of well, also the eclipse season of July. You know, do you guys remember what happened to you in July of this year and also in January of this year? Those would be very intense times. Well, this is kind of the culmination of all of that built up. And so, you know, it's easy to blame Mercury retrograde, but we've had the Saturn, the Mars-Uranus opposition that's been charged, really intense. And then now we have Saturn and Pluto, and then we have Neptune in Pisces, and then Chiron. And so that's the chart of the coming new moon. And now I'm going to talk about the outer planets, and we're going to talk about Saturn and Pluto, and we'll talk about a few, you know, we'll talk about these three over here. But so this is, you know, this is how the astrological system works. And the table really helps us see the movements of the planets and how it's all going. Any questions? Do we have questions? Yes.
So when you say that it's a culmination coming up
Mm-hmm.
Does that look like integration or like resolution, or is it just like way more intense than it ever was?
You think that's possible?
I don't know.
All right, so let's talk about the Saturn Pluto conjunction. So Saturn again came into Capricorn in 2018, right at the winter solstice of 2018. Yeah, and I don't know, but Saturn rules Capricorn. Soon as Saturn came into Capricorn, it's like we all felt it. It was like it was like and then personally, I have Saturn right here. So I was going through my second Saturn return when Saturn came into Capricorn, and so it was like, oh my God, it was like the beginning. And
That was in January. Was that in January when it came into Cap?
it was at the 21st of December 2018.
Wasn't that when we had our big storm and,
That was the
Yeah.
20th. That was this
and all
last.
the lights were out?
Yeah, yeah.
2019.
No, that was last year.
Yeah.
But that was 2018, right?
Well, there was there's the 2000.
1 year ago. It's just almost 1 year ago. Just
No. So I'm sorry. So that would have been late 2017. Right. Okay. Sorry.
2017.
Yeah, it would have been late 2017.
December 2017.
Yeah, because so yes, right before it became 2018, that Saturn came in. So Saturn has been in it's going to be 2 years, and then by summer it'll be into Aquarius. So, and Saturn spends 2.5 years. And so when Saturn came in at the beginning of winter 2017, Capricorn had already been in, Pluto had already been in, but Saturn rules Capricorn. So as soon as Saturn came into Capricorn, Saturn started ruling most of the charts because it's exalted. It's really strong. It's an own sign. And so this is a technique we'll teach you guys a little bit later on in the course, where Saturn, where whenever a planet is in its own sign, it becomes very powerful, and then any planet in Capricorn becomes ruled by Saturn. So then, right at that point, Saturn and Pluto became really closely connected, and we started feeling it. And as Saturn moved into, and see, then we have the nodal axis. The nodal axis, so, and then the nodal axis moves backward, and so then in late 2018, the nodal axis came in, and then Saturn was getting closer, and the nodal axis is the point in the sky where whenever the new moon and the full moon are aligned with it, it's an eclipse. So then we started having, with January 2019, we had an eclipse of the sun and the moon, and in alignment with Saturn and Pluto. So that was the real intensity of January 2019. And then again, when the sun was in Cancer, it was all again in alignment with the nodes. And then now the nodes are going to be over here, and on December 25th, on December 25th, we have sun, moon. See, this is what December 25th is going to look like.
this year.
That's
So
just
is
the...
it a good time to be like away from family or with family?
Is there a good time to be with family? Oh, sorry. It's going to be a very intense Christmas, is what I think. And then whether you're with family,
As quiet as you can be is better?
was that?
As quiet as you can be is better?
I think that whether you're quiet or you're away or you're close, you're going to feel it. It's going to, whatever whenever you're going to do, you're going to feel it. we're all going to feel it, and it's going to really feel like last January and this July. You know, it's like, you know, and there's a deep, deep purpose to it all, but that's, you know, so that's what it's going to look like, and then this continues for a while too, you know, so it's not like, you know, after 2020, January, Saturn and Pluto will be together, and then it's going to be easy after that, because Saturn's going to go out of Aquarius, and then he'll turn retrograde and come back, and then next fall, you have Jupiter, Saturn, and Pluto in the triple conjunction.
In the fall of 2020?
In the fall of 2020.
I thought,
So, was that?
I thought Uranus was in Capricorn by next December. No,
Oh,
sorry,
no, Uranus is in Taurus.
Okay, never mind.
Yeah. So then, you know, we introduced, you know, the concept of the age of Aquarius, you know, and then Saturn will move into Aquarius after that, and then Pluto in a few years are going to move, and then into Aquarius as well. Some powerful changes are occurring, and so let's. So these are the movements of the planets, and I'm putting a lot of information here. But let's look at the archetypal structure of Saturn-Pluto conjunction, and let's look in history back at what it was like. So let's look at Saturn. Well, first archetypal. Saturn is the timekeeper. It relates to time. In his most affectionate feature, you could call him the Grim Reaper. You could also call him the dweller on the threshold, or in the tarot, the hermit carrying the lamp of wisdom. In the alchemists called Saturn the Sol Niger, the black sun. In astrology, Saturn is the end of all the personal planets. Saturn is about boundaries. It's about who I am, where I end, and where does the collective begin. Saturn is what keeps me whole in the light of the collective. If I don't have a very strong Saturn, I'm very porous. I get affected by everything going on in the collective. When Saturn is strong and well integrated, I know this is your shit, this is mine. I know I don't take it on. But if Saturn is weak, then I don't know, is this mine or is this yours? Or is this collective? Am I feeling the collective crisis, or am I feeling just a personal crisis? And that's really important, because we talk about this being a time of personal crisis, but it is also a time of collective crisis, and that collective crisis kind of seeps into our personal processes. We start feeling that personal crisis, that collective crisis, and we identify with it. So Saturn tells us that this is not yours, this is, or this is yours. So Saturn also has two features as the timekeeper, Kairos and Chronos. Kairos being, Chronos being linear time, tick-tock, tick-tock, tick-tock. That's Saturn is the timekeeper. Also Saturn is Kairos, magical time. Those times of transformations, sometimes we hit a phase in our life where, we have these peak experiences, the transformational experiences, and time just kind of stops, and it feels like, so that's a Kairos, and that's also ruled by Saturn. So very important archetype, Saturn, the Grim Reaper. Now Pluto is the furthest planet out into the universe. It's so far, and if we got on the ship and went at the speed of light, it would probably take us a good long time, like 100 years to get there. It's very, very far, but it's this dense ball of lead. It's like so. If Jupiter had a collision with Jupiter, it would go right through like a ball of hot molten solid going through a pound of butter. Because Jupiter is like really light and gases. It's not really very. It's like full of hot air, and Pluto's really dense, and so the gravity of Pluto, and Hades is the lord of hell. So Pluto is hell, and so it's associated with death and transformation. It's also associated with ancestral. Whenever we study astrology and you study somebody's chart, wherever Pluto is, that's where the ancestral rage is. And whatever Pluto connects with, that's where I connect with my ancestral rage. And so you got the timekeeper, the grim reaper, and the Lord of Hell coming together, and they do so every 40 years. They do so every 40 years. Now let's look at the last opposition of Pluto and Saturn. Okay? And then on that day, the moon was in square. And that was, Pluto was still in Sagittarius. And then, and then like that. Okay, so we have Pluto, Saturn opposition with the moon in the T-square. That's September, what is it? September 11, 2001.
This was the last time?
This is an opposition. Okay? And then Saturn and Pluto are in conjunction in Libra in 1980. So that's the last one. For those who were around in 1980, 81, 82, 83, what does that feel like? You guys remember? Even though there was that cheery movie, remember that cheery movie, The Day After? And then you get to see that? We were so tense at that time. We thought, wow, for sure the States and the Russians are going to go at it, and it's going to be the end of the world. We're not going to see the 1990s. We're all freaked out, and the tension in the collective was so intense, very similar to what's going on right now. So that's the last Saturn-Pluto conjunction. And then the one before that, Saturn-Pluto in Leo, 1941, 1942. Okay? So it kind of sets, it kind of gives us, and then you go back into time, and very intense times in our collective, and if you're interested in such cheery subject matters, there's a great book called Cosmos and Psyche by Richard Tarnas, where he breaks down all the outer planetary alignments over the last 3,000 years. And then he studies the Saturn-Pluto cycle in depth in that book, and also other outer planetary alignments. Richard Tarnas, Tarnas, Cosmos and Psyche. Probably the best astrology book of our generation. It is, took him 30 years to write. It's so well researched, and it explains astrology in a very, very practical, academic way. It's meant for intellectuals and scientists. It's to convince them of the validity of astrology and how astrology maps out the growth of our collective. It's a fabulous book. And most of this workshops is all based on it. I read it 3 times myself, and it's really an amazing book to learn these outer planetary cycles. So then Saturn, Pluto in conjunction. Now, whenever, remember we were talking about the sun and the moon coming together, and the moon, the new moon, there's a death, and then the new moon comes and there's a rebirth. That's why the new moon is so difficult. The new moon includes two things. It includes death and rebirth. So then it's the same thing. Saturn's coming in, and we have all this tension and this tension and tension, and there will be a certain release. And then when Saturn starts getting to the other side of Pluto, there's going to be a lot, aside from the fact that a lot of things are dying, we're also giving form to the rebirth that's taking place. There are old structures that are falling apart, and these old structures that we're having to let go of. We're also working really hard to create new structures for ourselves. We're starting new phases of our life, and then when Saturn gets on the other side, then we have another 40-year cycle, coming of the Saturn Pluto. And as you go along, you can always follow the relationships of Saturn and Pluto, just like we looked at the sun and the moon. We also, it's the same thing, the conjunction, the square, the opposition, the square. These are all key points when Saturn and Pluto will have strong tension, and there will be integration of the lessons that we're learning right now. But again, this is a 40-year cycle, so now we're going to the new moon phase of Saturn Pluto, and it's triggering a lot of dying. And also, I have a line, I call it, what is dying to be reborn in you is what's going on. Something is dying to be reborn in our process. And so understanding this, and one of the things that happens in these kind of times, is that we're going through this great tension, and it's easy to blame it on our partners or on the ones that are close to us, and to think it's your fault, or to think that, it is because, it is because of my current situation. But these are internal processes. They can be internalized to great benefits. And so that's really the meaning of the 745, of the Saturn Pluto. Now, in 7:45, so we're going to 9, so we have an hour and 15 minutes left. So before we go into the myth of Persephone, let me give you a few more little pointers. One, we talked about the last Saturn Pluto conjunction in Libra, so 80 to 83, 81 to 83, but Pluto, is, I think as early as, because Pluto moves so slowly, anybody born around that time has Pluto in Libra, and then Saturn and Pluto are in square to Pluto. And then 81 to 83, Saturn and Pluto are in conjunction, and then Saturn and Pluto is in exact square. So that generation is feeling it really heavily. It's the tension is palpable for that generation. Also a generation that's really feeling it is 88 to 2000. And there's, the 88 to 1990 kind of have been through most of the heavy times already. The 90 to 93, 94, I did someone's chart on the weekend that has, Uranus and Neptune, woo! Uranus and Neptune in exact conjunction, and then Saturn and Pluto, and Saturn and Pluto are right there for them. So like, wow. So that, the Uranus-Neptune generation, and then those born a little earlier also have Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune. And Saturn, they've just had, they just turned 30. And now, the Saturn return is happening. And then 93, Saturn is over here. So when Saturn goes over there, anyway, that generation is coming to an awakening, or they're coming of age. I call it the spiritual quest of the millennial, and it's awakening with a lot of them. It's like the tension is really intense, and we can see it in them. And Uranus Neptune in a conjunction, we have the Uranus is the great revolutionary, Neptune is the great mystic. And so Uranus and Neptune in conjunction, they're spiritual revolutionaries. And with Saturn over there, it's like the tension, to either stay asleep or to wake up. And this generation, spiritual wisdom comes to them very easily, but is also very easily distracted from there. Or, Neptune is, escapism in its shadow, and Uranus is technology. So you got a bunch of hippies, they go to the bush, and they bring electronic music, and they and they do drugs all weekend long. And they call that a spiritual experience.
That sounds like the quarry in Cobble Hill.
What's that?
The quarry in Cobble Hill.
The quarry in Cobble Hill. I'm new to the area, but
It's what you're talking about.
all right. So there you go. So that's Uranus Neptune, but also Uranus is the great revolutionary and Neptune's the great mystic. So then there is a affinity for mystical, and when Saturn and Pluto coming right through that, then that is potentially very powerful awakening for that generation if they're willing to do the work. But that's true for all of us, isn't it?
But you said specifically 88 to 2000, right?
That's the 88 to 2000. As you move towards 2000, Uranus and Pluto move over here. Uranus and Neptune move over here, and Saturn goes further and further. So those folks are going to get their Saturn return, but a little bit later. So those are very key times. So I think that really, and for those of you who don't know much about astrology, that's probably way too much information. But did we follow most of it? Was it clear? How are we doing?
I wanted to speak to the Christmas thing, because you were saying how the new moon is a really good opportunity for letting go and bringing in new and intention setting. And with new moon being on Christmas this year, would it not be a potentially really good time to redefine what Christmas means?
Absolutely. See, the profound meaning of Saturn and Pluto, and we're going to go into that with the myth of Persephone and what it means. But it's easy to focus on the negatives, and we're all feeling the tension. It's palpable. But what's the great benefit of all that tension? That intensity that's going on, the falling apart of all those structures that are falling apart in our lives. What is the benefit in all of that?
Change.
It is forcing us to face shadow issues that have been haunting us for a long, long time, and we get to have to do the work to heal them. If we do the work to deal with it, if we do the deep intentional, like you're saying, Diana, if you do the deep intentional work of really listening to what is being triggered by these times and integrate them, it can be a very important kairos, a time of transformation, a time of empowerment, a time, Are you guys, do you know the blue light special? You remember the blue light special?
Right on the TV.
You have to be a little older for that. The blue light special, you remember Kmart? Kmart? All right. Well, Kmart, you used to have the blue light special. On all 23, we have a blue light special. They would bring the blue light, and everybody would go on item 23, and the whole aisle would get emptied. At least that's how it was in the commercial. And so there's kind of a blue light special now. There's a blue light special on empowerment. You know, if we are willing to be the change that we want to see in the world, then these times can be tremendously empowering. But of course, we have to let go of old patterns. And so then we're back to the age of Aquarius, you know. The age of Aquarius, and why is it so difficult to go from one age to the other? It's because old patterns no longer serve us, and we have to let go of them to create new patterns. But these old patterns, they don't die so easily. So that's why Saturn and Pluto is tremendously beneficial, that it's kind of challenging these old patterns, breaking them down, having them, you know, and then we get to redefine ourselves through that process. So then there's a great advantage that comes with such heavy times. Of course, if we stay attached to the old patterns, the old definitions, then these times are really, really challenging, because we're holding on to things that are dying. And that's where potentially the great crisis can unfold. And then usually Saturn-Pluto alignments, conjunctions, bring about tremendous states of crisis in the collective, because these patterns that have crystallized over millennia are no longer valid, and we are redefining the masculine and the feminine in our times. And so that brings us to the myth of Persephone. Are you guys all familiar with the myth of Persephone? No? Some of us? Okay, so Persephone, so the myth of Persephone, to give you a bit of an understanding of where it comes from, well, it's a Greek myth. And in early Greek times, and actually preceding the Greeks, the celebrations of the equinoxes, so fall equinox, when the night starts taking over for the day, and spring equinox, when again light starts to dominate again, those were celebrated by the Eleusinian mysteries, where the myth of Persephone was reenacted. They would do plays, and they would reenact, you know, and then throughout the ages, it kept on going like that, and then, you know, the Celts have a version of it, and all of the native cultures, you know, in the northern hemisphere, but also in the southern hemisphere, these festivals to celebrate the equinoxes and the solstices, the festivals of the light, were enacted, and the story of Persephone was told. So Persephone is the daughter of Demeter. So Demeter is the earth or the moon, and in astrology, Persephone is Venus. And so whenever we look at a chart, and whenever there's the moon and in angle to Venus, there's usually a great tension between the mother and the daughter. And so the myth of Persephone acts out that myth where there's a tension between Demeter and Persephone. Persephone is coming of age. You know, Demeter is aging. She's a mother. Persephone is coming into the, in the flower of her youth. you know, and there's usually a friction that is created at that time between the mother and the daughter, and then also, of course, the father, the son, you know, and then there's kind of a competition between the young daughter trying to get attention from the father, and then the mother, and then usually there's some jealousy and some tension that exists, and this is a natural phenomena that is that is as old as humanity, that the mother and the maiden, and that process of the maiden coming of age and awakening to her sexuality, and then later on also becoming a mother. That's the myth. That is the ground of the myth of Persephone. And so then the mother and the daughter, the tension, and then there's a collusion. There's a kind of a, where Persephone is left unprotected, and Hades, the lord of hell, comes out, and there's a situation where Venus collects flowers, and then Pluto comes out from Hades, from hell, and kidnaps her and brings her down to hell and forcibly makes her his wife. Now, when Venus is kidnapped by Hades, the lord of hell, all of nature goes dormant, like what happens in winter. And then Demeter is quite concerned, and she thinks, well, I should have, this tension that I had with my daughter, this me not protecting her, I really made a mistake here, this is not good, we need to do something. So then she goes to Jupiter, Zeus, and she advocates, she says, you got to do something, you got to rescue my daughter, Pluto is your brother, you can do something about it. So then Jupiter, Zeus, calls Mercury, because Mercury can travel, he's the messenger of the sun, and he can go down to hell, and he's got wings on his feet, wings on his head. So Jupiter dispatches Mercury to go and rescue Persephone, and Mercury, the trickster that he is, makes a deal with Hades. He says, okay, dude, she's your wife now, why don't you let her come back to the world 6 months out of the year, and you can have 6 months of the year, and in that way everybody will be happy. And then Pluto says, okay. And so then Persephone rises up again, and then that's what is celebrated at the equinoxes, is the return in the spring of Persephone, of life, to summer, and then at the fall equinox we celebrate Venus, the light, going back under to hell. And so that's the myth of Persephone. Now we'll analyze what it means psychologically, and you guys can chime in and give some. I'm going to ask you guys. So what do you think, goes through, and well, first, who is Persephone in our own inner processes? That's a good question, huh? Who is Persephone in our own processes? Like these planets that we project out onto the world, they represent inner functions in ourselves.
Should be the animus, no?
The animus, well, no, the anima. Yes. But I identify it, and I see it in the chart as what we call the inner child. That inner part of myself, that is the joy. That is what I love, my creativity. In our our society, Venus has been neglected and she's been sent down to hell. She's not empowered. And, we have a very shadow engagement, and that's really what's going on in our age, is we're trying to stop the abuse of the inner child, stop the abuse of the feminine, and especially the young feminine, and all versions of the feminine. But that's represented, by the maiden, by the beauty, and so then Persephone gets kidnapped into hell, and that really resonates to all of us. It's like our inner child has kind of been in hell for a long time, and that's kind of what's going on with these times, is we're realizing that our focus hasn't been balanced. We've been going, go, extroverted, as a culture, and we're realizing that we need to take care of the inner child more. We need to contain and love the inner child, and that the inner child is in hell. And that's really significant in the process that we're going through. Now, what do you think it's like for Venus to go down into hell? What happens to her? What transformation does she go through?
Loss of innocence.
The loss of innocence. Yes, but what else also?
A loss of her family.
A loss of her family, yes.
She's also probably discovering
Her sexuality.
Loss of virginity.
A loss of virginity. She becomes initiated by Hades.
Finds her power then.
What's that?
She finds her power.
She finds her power. I mean, Pluto, he's a pretty powerful dude,
Transformation.
He's the Lord of hell, So he initiates her into all of the sacred rites. She becomes aware of what happens, and she becomes the wife of the Lord of hell, So then what do you think happens when she rises above, comes back? Do you think she's all neurotic and all shy? Or does she how does she rise up?
Well, she has to walk between both worlds
Mm-hmm.
smoothly.
Smoothly, she gets to be that person.
Yeah.
What else do you think happens to her? I call it...
She's gonna get in trouble, that's all.
Well, you guys are in trouble, and I'm not
She's the
empowering
too much
you. Yes,
woman.
but
Too much.
She's probably going to be the too much woman.
That's right.
she becomes a too much woman. No, I think she rises up as a priestess. She been initiated, and she's coming into the power. You think anybody's gonna mess with her at that point?
She has no
She's
way.
like, I'm the queen of Hades.
I'm the queen of hell, and I'm the queen of heaven. I'm the queen of everything.
That's the embodiment of duality.
She's in the embodiment of duality, but she also rediscovers her power. And I think that that's really the benefit of this Saturn Pluto conjunction, is in this process of going down into hell, we're actually being reborn into our power. We're going through this process of integrating the shadow, and we're becoming initiated into the mysteries. Isn't that beautiful?
Excellent.
Can I clap?
It's, what's that?
I want to clap.
Yay!
Is that the
Now, what do you think? What do you think? Go ahead.
Is that the key to surviving the Saturn Pluto?
Absolutely, is to go down and rescue the inner child, and the inner child, and to nurture the inner child, and to bring the inner child back from hell, to take the sacred feminine within our process, and that's for both men and women. We're being invited, and the Priestess Rising. What does that mean? What is the archetype of the priestess? What is the archetype of the priestess? What is the function of the priestess, and where does the priestess come from?
Is it justice and knowledge and... I'm trying to think of the tarot card.
Justice, yes. Well, the priestess, the archetype of the priestess predates the patriarchal age. The priestess, they were servants of the Great Mother during the matriarchy, and their function was to honor and support the rites of passages.
The holder of knowledge.
They were the holder of knowledge, but they also did the sacred ceremonies of initiation. You know, all of the sacred passages were honored by the priestess. You know, whether it is the new moon, whether it's the solstice, the equinox, the priestess, and these sacred ceremonies that the priestess did initiated men into manhood, brought the children into the different stages of evolution, also prepared the dying for death, and all of these rites of passages. And of course, when we went into the patriarchy, these were replaced by priests, and they did the same thing, and the priestess was sent back down to hell. In the Christian era, the feminine and the devil were associated together, and then so much so that the feminine, now we associated hell being ruled by the feminine. Liz Green wrote a book, The Astrology of Fate, and she tells all of the different myths that identify the Lord of Hell being feminine. So it's as if Venus went down into hell and just kind of took over. And now she's in there. And now our job is to bring her back and to also bring back the function of the priestess. The reason why we're so dissociated as a collective is because we have lost these functions. We have lost these understanding, and we're learning to do these things again. Learning to celebrate the new moon and the full moon and the rites of passages, and to bring the children into the world and to making them part of the tribe. These were all functions of the priestess and the priestess's rising. Does that make sense? How does that feel? So it really gives a twist to these times, and it also really empowers this shift of the age of Aquarius. But I have another question for you. What do you think happens to Hades? What do you think happens to Pluto in this whole thing? And it's really, what happens to the masculine in this whole process?
Well, he's diminished a little.
He's diminished?
Yeah.
He gets to take over again?
What's that?
He gets to take over again?
He gets to take over again? I think that this is because we can't think of having the feminine being reborn without the masculine being reborn too. So think about Pluto, think about the dude, hanging out in hell, frying some people, and, what does the guy feel like down there?
He might miss her.
Well, he's missing her, yeah, but before he gets her, before she becomes his wife, before he becomes his wife, that's a lonely job. That, and that's the state of the current masculine in our times, the tension of the masculine energy as we see the feminine rising. So yes, but what do you think that Venus Persephone does for him? Okay, yes, he initiates her into all the sacred arts, but what does she do for him?
Cares for him.
She heals him. She brings joy to his life. And so that this rebirth of the feminine that we're going through is also a rebirth of the masculine. We can't have the two. one without the other. And so the myth of Persephone also has a great influence on the masculine. This process that we're going through there's the rebirth of the masculine also taking place, where so in the man, taking care of the feminine soul and having the feminine soul be nurtured again, it's tremendously healing for the masculine energy. And if the man can heal that way, then he can support the woman in her healing process. And so that's another twist in the myth of Persephone. So, how are we doing? How are we doing on time?
It's 10 after 8.
10 after 8. Wow, we got time for a really beautiful discussion. I have something that I want to suggest to you guys that's a development. But do we have any questions about where we've been? Yes?
I just have something.
Okay.
Well, it just seems like the shift is towards balance.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we can't have one part of our soul being reborn without the other part of our soul. And so all of us have a masculine side of our personality and a feminine side of our personality. And in this time of transformation, one to the Aquarian age, and then we're going to look at the symbolism of the Aquarian age, and we can see these things rising to the surface. What is going on is that we're redefining masculine energy and we're redefining feminine energy. And that's the meaning of the healer and the dreamer. If we can honor, the connection of the feminine to the unconscious, the dreamer, and if we can honor the fact that solar energy in essence is healing energy. And that if men can become healers and if women can connect themselves to the unconscious and be the priestess, then we can change, this, into this age of Aquarius. And that's what's being called. And I think that this time, this Saturn Pluto Conjunction, this incredible tension that we're all going through, serves that in a powerful way. So even though it's really deeply powerful, we need to allow this process to take place within ourselves, with rituals, like you were saying, to honor the, and what does that mean in our practical lives? What does that mean in our practical lives?
Good question.
What does it mean in our practical lives?
You mean, what is ritual? Doing rituals?
Yeah.
No, this rebirth. What does it mean in our personal, and what is seeking to, what is dying within us to be reborn?
Well, we're losing being one-sided,
Being one-sided. And how, in practical terms, is that one-sidedness showing up?
well, war,
War,
struggle.
the war against nature. But what else? You pointed to two qualities. He called it the introvert and the extrovert. And in astrology, we have the masculine signs and the feminine signs. The masculine sign being extroverted signs, the feminine side being introverted signs. So that feminine nature is really an introverted nature, and masculine nature is an extroverted nature. And in our day and age, we put all our eggs into one basket of extroversion. We are so extroverted as a group, and we celebrate extroversion so much so that if I take time out to be introverted, I feel guilty.
Well, when we get ridiculed, too.
We get ridiculed. We feel, when we think of an introvert, we basically think of somebody who's neurotic. who's not, who's a loser, a hippie, or something else, So then we see that in our processes, even though we integrating some spiritual, some tools, we have such a hard time integrating and giving time for the processes of going down in the inner journey and rescuing Venus, rescuing Persephone from hell. We don't take the time to do that, and therefore we're always in pain. And our society has lost respect for feminine values, and it's all extroversion, all extroversion. So then, in a practical application of this is to learn, in my opinion, the greatest revolutionary act we can do as individual is to slow the fuck down. And to take time for introversion and to say, I don't need to always be going. I have to take time. And to me, that's why we're all having these breakdowns, is because we're always focused on the effect that we're having on the outer world, and we're not taking time for our spiritual practice, for our nurturing, for the path of giving our Venus a voice, of taking the inner child and holding the inner child and giving the inner child a voice through creativity and spiritual practice. Does that make sense? So then, if we do that, then what is that going to look like? Because the integration of the priestess is both there for men and for women. And so a man or a woman, what does it look like in my practical process if I integrate this lesson of letting the priestess rise in my process? What is that going to look like?
Like as an outcome or the process itself?
In the process itself and as an outcome, both.
Well, it's a lot of integration of the repressed belief system, repressed emotions, and just giving that, like you said, the other side of ourselves the love that it needs to feel complete on its own instead of always searching outside for it. And then a person stands up in their own strength with,
Like Venus rising up from hell.
their own self-worth without the other world needing to reflect it back to them.
Exactly. So we extrovert as a way of overcompensating for our inner self that's being, not giving what it needs. And so we keep working really hard because we think that that's how our inner self's going to be happy. And he keeps screaming, what the fuck, dude? And, and so, so then if we take the time to nurture the inner self, then what's the first thing that happens?
Cries a bunch.
We cry a bunch, yeah. And what's the second thing that happens?
I think it means to be more self-empowered.
More self-empowered.
Rather than not relying on others to define you, but you defining yourself.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
The process itself is just, without getting into how each of us is going to do it, I think it's just could it be summed up as just a state of mindfulness, of being aware of where your state is.
Right. Absolutely. I qualify it, and in my readings and in my work, I bring up, if you take the inner child and you nurture the inner child and you love the inner child and you give it expression through creativity, the first thing that happens after the crying is the joy that comes. Venus Persephone is joy. When Venus is rising above into the myth of Persephone, everybody's throwing a party. Yay! Life is returning. So then the rising of Persephone, the rising of the inner child, brings joy. And that's how right away we know that we are doing our work, because we're starting to feel joy. And then if we come from a place of joy, then everything becomes so much more easier. And that's, and we're doing everything to try to get joy, but we're doing it in an extroverted way. And what is it doing? It's just bringing us closer and closer to chaos. We have to go back into the inner process and rescue Persephone. But there's another thing that's going to happen if we do that in our process.
Releasing the libido.
Releasing the libido, yes, creative energy will be released. But then the Priestess Rising means that we can again live life in a sacred way. You know, honoring life, taking the time to celebrate. You know, you were saying, you know, does that mean I go home to, you know, for Christmas, you know? Well, I go home for Christmas and I celebrate the fact that Mom and Dad has given me birth. And I learn to celebrate and to show up with joy, knowing that, yeah, you know, these last, you know, especially the 19th century, but, you know, the whole 2,000 years, you know, well, it's not all bad, but the conflict of our age, as we have moved away from honoring the rites of passages and into all-out extroversion, as we return, then we can live life in a sacred manner again. And that's going, then if we live life in a sacred manner, are we going to have the problems that we have currently in our society? Are we going to allow the earth to be raped over and over again? Or are we going, you know, we're going to change the way we live by this simple process of learning to give a voice to the inner goddess. Woo!
Yeah.
Huh.